What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So today we're going to talk a little bit about this paper I found. I read this paper the other day. I thought it was a really good paper. This is the kind of paper that I think would be like a really good introductory paper for anyone that wants to learn about the genetics of intelligence and how the genetics influences individual differences in the brain related to intelligence. Like if you were to use this paper in a graduate class or something for teaching people about the neuroscience of intelligence, it would be a really good paper. It's very clearly written, a very good review. Recent paper from 2020, so current information, pretty current as far as what the state of the neuroscience of intelligence is right now. So going forward, it's probably going to be a little bit longer of a video, but what do we know about research on intelligence in general? And all of the information here, unless otherwise indicated, is from this paper. So yeah, research on intelligence, kind of controversial in the political sense, right? Particularly when it comes to certain things like group differences or whatever. You know, there's a lot of discourse around intelligence. I think because people assign such a high value to intelligence, right? And people probably also have a bit of a folk psychology about what intelligence is. Everyone thinks they can identify someone who's smart or stupid, right? You know, that's kind of one of the go-to insults for people is like, you're dumb. So everyone kind of has an idea of it, but then you get into discourse on intelligence and some people are like, well, what's intelligence anyway? I don't really know. How do we even know who's stupid or smart? But yeah, I mean, we can tell. So there's controversies in that. There's also controversies as far as the science of intelligence, which they go over in a box in this paper, most of those pretty resolved. Why? Because, you know, research on intelligence in psychology, neuroscience is among the most replicable in the field. Very high replicability on intelligence. Additionally, very high general consensus in the field on intelligence research. So there's not typically those kinds of controversies. There are a lot of political controversies given the extent to which people assign value to intelligence, you know, probably worth to intelligence. The idea that, you know, someone of a high intelligence is worth more, low intelligence is worth less, and of course the extent to which genetics contributes to intelligence. You know, we have heritability of intelligence ranging from, you know, 50%, some estimates, up to 80%, some estimates. This paper in this video is all about that, the genetics of intelligence. So research findings, very robust, as I said, very replicable. We see the same things over and over and over. We see multiple lines of converging evidence. We're going to go over a lot of that here. So let's go on now to the next slide, the phenotype of intelligence. So what is a genotype? Your genes. What is your phenotype? How your genes are expressed. We think of phenotype as something like height, right? You have genes for height. How tall you are is your phenotype. Personality is also a phenotype, right? Your personality traits are a phenotype. Your cognitive abilities are a phenotype, and that's what we're looking at with the phenotype of intelligence. What is it? What is intelligence? You know, some people are like, I don't even know what intelligence is. What does it mean? It's not even well defined. It's actually really, really well defined. So we're talking about things like cognitive ability, cognitive performance, cognitive functioning, mental ability, right? IQ is one measurement, estimating intelligence, but there's many, many different tests, okay? Intelligence is reasoning, problem solving, it's understanding complex ideas. The ability to learn quickly is intelligence, catching on, making sense of things. And then what they give in this paper, you know, a rapid and accurate problem solving. So probably most of what you think about, and I've asked people this before, I said, what do you think an intelligent person is like? When you hear intelligent, what does it mean to you? And I've asked people, so kind of our folk understanding of what intelligence is. People will list things that are always, you know, almost always highly correlated with actual measurements, you know, psychometric measurements, IQ, that sort of thing, of intelligence. So people that, you know, say, we don't even know what intelligence is, it doesn't seem to be the case. You know, people have a pretty good understanding as far as language, the way we conceptualize intelligence just as lay people, and what intelligence is in science, right? In the research on intelligence and that sort of a thing. We know what it is. You say someone's intelligent, you know what they mean. Most of the things that you think of an intelligent person would express or have as traits or do, those are things, you know, associated with actual measurements of intelligence. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. Cognitive abilities, we mentioned that in the previous slide. Very important to understand. All cognitive abilities are correlated. So you have an IQ test. IQ tests are correlated with memory tests, with attention tests, with tests of reasoning, with tests of processing speed, focus. All of these different mental abilities are correlated with one another, and this creates a hierarchy of variances, okay? John Carroll, all of these things, yeah. Go see the paper. Anything I reference here is taken, just ripped straight from this paper. So John Carroll did 400 studies of diverse cognitive measurements, took all of these together, looked. Yeah, they all correlate positively, and this is the important thing. 40% of the variance in all of these different measures of cognitive ability, all of these different cognitive measurements, I should say, like things like memory and attention, all of that. 40% of the variance explained by a general factor. And that's what we're talking about when we say G, the G factor. This general factor of cognitive ability, of intelligence. So, all of these different cognitive abilities correlated with one another and explained by some latent trait, right? Something going on that determines your memory, your processing speed, your reasoning ability, and all of that. Where do you think that stuff is located? Is it located in the fingers, in the knee? It's located in the head, right? It's located in the brain, obviously. Unless you believe in, you're a dualist or something. I don't know. Maybe it's located in the spirit, but neuroscientists, we think it's located in the brain. Here is an image explaining this variance, right? The way these things are related. So we have this G factor, general intelligence or general cognitive ability. This is called G, and you'll see this in the literature. This explains about 40% of the variance, as I said. And this, goes into all kinds of different domains. So domain 1 in this image, memory, right? You might think memory is different from intelligence or something like that, but it's closely related. And then below that, specific cognitive tests. So all kinds of different tests for memory, right? You have things like digit span recall or like word recall tests, all kinds of different memory tests. Same with verbal ability, same with reasoning tasks, attention tasks. You can go down the line and you'll see, okay, G predicts a lot in these domains, and these domains, consistent across all of these different measurements that measure like, memory is a lot of different things, right? But it's still correlated with intelligence across, Let's go on now to the next slide. The stability of intelligence. So what does that mean? How stable is intelligence across the lifespan? We know personality traits in general are pretty stable. Intelligence, very stable, much more than many other things. Very high test-retest scores, right? Correlation of 0.6 to 0.7, so pretty high. You take an intelligence test, tomorrow, you take an intelligence test in 3 years, it's not going to change very much. Why? Probably because your, individual intelligence didn't change that much. Probably also because the tests are kind of good for that sort of a thing. Here's a passage from the paper. I wanted to read it to you. So, tests that involve active mental work, aspects of fluid intelligence, decline in mean levels from young or middle adulthood to older age. So, intelligence, fluid intelligence, because we have fluid intelligence, crystallized intelligence, but fluid intelligence declines a little bit with age. Yeah, we know that. These include cognitive domains such as processing speed, memory, visuospatial ability, and pattern using blocks, and visuospatial ability such as the replication of a two-dimensional pattern using blocks in the Wechsler block design test, abstract reasoning, such as the inductive reasoning from abstract patterns that is required in Raven's progressive matrices. These more age-sensitive cognitive domains tend to age in concert, with half or more than half of individual differences in their age-related declines accounted for by the aging of general fluid intelligence. So, important, we said, let me explain what this means. We said that intelligence correlates with all of these other cognitive abilities, right? We see intelligence decline a little bit with age, fluid intelligence, and we see the same thing happen with all of these other different cognitive tests, don't we? So that's another way that we kind of know, like, okay, yeah, there's a general factor here of intelligence, a general factor of cognitive ability that's influencing all of these other things. They're all declining with age. Let's go on now to the next slide. So, intelligence, predictive validity. What is this when you have a psychometric test? Predictive validity. This is the idea that your test is predicting something that you associate with the construct. So, if you think like, what is an intelligent person like? What do they do? Probably a really big thing you think of is like someone who's really good at school, right? Some people will say, education is not intelligence and blah, blah, blah. And education is not intelligence itself. But smart people do well doing smart people things. And yeah, getting a STEM degree or whatever the case may be, getting high grades at school, performing, excelling academically, that kind of thing. Yeah, those are smart people things. And what do we see? Intelligence, highly correlated with all kinds of different educational measurements. Educational attainment at 0.8, so very high correlation. The years of education that someone completes, the grades that they get, the highest degree that they get, right? People with master's degrees more intelligent on average than people with bachelor's degrees. People with PhDs more intelligent on average than people with master's degrees. So yeah, very high correlations for all of these educational measurements. Job performance as well. We know intelligence is a very good predictor of how well you're going to do on the job and how well you're going to learn tasks on the job. We also know that intelligence is a very good predictor of socioeconomic ascension, right? So people going from a lower class to a higher class. Who does well? More intelligent people. Better health, very robustly correlated with intelligence across many, many different health measures. Why is that? Smart people probably, they can delay kind of gratification. They can make better decisions. They can learn what decisions to make, whatever the case may be. And there's a lot of things not mentioned in this paper that are correlated with intelligence. You can find all kinds of things, that you think, okay, yeah, I could see how smart people would do better at that. Like, I use an example here, firearm accuracy. There's a correlation with intelligence scores, IQ, and having accuracy shooting a firearm. Why is that? I don't know, but maybe that's something you would consider, associated with intelligence as well. Like, yeah, they focus better. They're a better shot. We know, intelligence is correlated with attention, so perhaps there's something going on with that. Let's go on now to the next slide, the heritability of intelligence. So what is that? How heritable is it? To what extent is intelligence passed on through your genes? We know from twin and family studies that about 50% of the variance is genetic, and this is higher for adults. It's lower in children, higher in adults. So this is something, that as you get older, you say, okay, yeah, big. This is, massively, massively replicated, that we see heritability of intelligence above 50%. We know, how do twin studies work? Let me explain that. You can see the degree to which traits are correlated in monozygotic twins, identical twins, right? Traits, whatever the case may be, all kinds of different traits. More correlated in people who share more genetic similarity than people who share no genetic similarity. So you can look at monozygotic twins, dizygotic twins, fraternal twins who are not identical twins, and then strangers and all of that. And that's what you see, Yeah, they're more likely to, to have intelligence that's highly correlated with one another. So this is, the heritability estimates based on those correlations we see from twins and family studies. And going forward, this is kind of what we're going to look at. Genes, but also brains. How are the genes associated with intelligence expressed in the brain? Because where does all your cognitive ability come from? Not from the knee, not from the soul, probably, in your brain. So what do we know about variance at the genetic level? Well, there have been some papers using genomic structural equation modeling. We know here that the genetic G factor, looking at, genes here, explained again about 54% of the variance. So again, consistent with the twin studies. So this provides some support for the idea that the phenotypic structure of intelligence is in part due to genetic effects that act on a general factor of intelligence and also at more specific cognitive levels. Interesting paper here by De La Fuente. That's one, if you like this original paper, maybe go and find that one as well. So, SNPs and this Grimmel SC, what's going on here? So, how close are your genes related to one another? You'll see, SNP, things like that, different ways of trying to look, tease out the genetics, what genes impact intelligence, right? So, the way this works is simply by looking at how similar are your cognitive test scores to your genetic similarity. Do people who have more genetic similarity have more similar cognitive test scores? Looking at things like this produces smaller estimates of heritability, but we still see a pretty substantial genetic contribution. This is probably because they're underpowered, right? So we see about 20 to 30%. When, for example, when you include families in this, and then they have this Grimmel kin where they include families into it, it again reproduces this 54% heritability estimate that we saw in the structural equation modeling of genes. So why? Probably because it captures more rare variants that are more restricted to families. Now you need big studies for this sort of thing. You need big samples, I should say. That's probably why you get lower estimates from this, and also things like GWAS, which we're going to talk about in a second here. We have dynastic effects that we also kind of have to tease out, but these don't seem to explain a lot, right? So we know, what is this? the parent genotype, the parent's genes, they contribute to the parent's phenotype, right? The expression of those genes. And then the parental phenotype shapes the offspring phenotype. So what's a good example of that? We know, there's a heritability for intelligence. More intelligent people are much more likely to go to school. You have a parent that goes to school, they're much more likely to get you into college too. And that's, offspring phenotype, behavior, It's not just the way you look or whatever. Behavior is a phenotype. So education. Educated parents put kids in schools. These are still genetic effects, but they're mediated by the environment, right? We see the initial genetic effect. The child is inheriting the parent's genes, but then, you also have a way that those are expressed there. Polygenic scores, they tend to capture both, okay? So like 29% will go down to 17%. But again, we know, it's genetic nonetheless. Lower estimates here than we see, with the twin studies, but probably, again, it's missing something, where the twin studies maybe are not. Let's go on now to the next slide. We have some research, not a ton, that can look at people who have been adopted and what happens when a child is adopted. It breaks this dynastic effect, doesn't it? They can no longer be influenced by the parent's genotype, right? You have all the genes of the parent, but you have no exposure to the biological parent. So the link is broken. These are good opportunities to study the genetics of intelligence. Yeah, and there's a few adoption studies out there that have looked at intelligence. And again, you see the same thing, that intelligence is more closely related to the genes of the biological parent than it is to the environments provided by the non-biological parent, which again, is pretty counterintuitive to a lot of people, especially in things like personality and things outside of intelligence. In behavioral genetics, the 50-0-50 rule, 50% is contributed by genes broadly across personality, cognitive abilities, blah, blah, blah. 0 is the shared environment, and that's basically the home environment. So home environments do relatively little. 50% is the non-shared environment, so all of that other stuff. Kind of, counterintuitive and contrary to what a lot of people would think, but, this is kind of what you see when you're able to tease out, like, who has the genes of these people, but no exposure to that environment. Anyway, let's go on. Next slide. We have these genome-wide association studies, right? Previously, there were these candidate gene studies where people would pick a gene and they would think, or a set of genes, and they would think, okay, I think these genes, maybe they have some association with intelligence. They didn't find much because they're pretty underpowered. Why is that? Because you probably, like most things in personality, cognitive ability, psychology, you probably don't just have a single gene for a thing, right? Instead, everything is polygenic, right? So you have a lot of genes that all contribute a little bit to everything. So GWAS doesn't pick these candidate loci, right? Loci or whatever, for the genes. Instead, it's just looking at, everything in a sense. You need, again, really, really big samples to do this. One of the earlier GWAS things, sample size a little bit over 3,000, didn't do it. Once we started seeing sample sizes of 200,000, with like the UK Biobank and that, then you begin to find hundreds of genetic areas that are associated with intelligence. And each one of these genetic areas contributes a little bit to intelligence. And so, that's probably why candidate genes thing. Probably at the time, these genome-wide association studies are probably still underpowered, but I don't know for sure. Let's go on. As I said, intelligence, highly polygenetic or polygenic, right? So GWAS shows us we don't have just a single intelligence gene. And I mention that because I've had people ask me like, well, if intelligence is genetic, where's the intelligence gene? And it's like, that's not the way a lot of genetic things work, right? You have additive effects. You have effects of genes that are, a lot of genes contributing a little bit to everything. But if you doubt, that intelligence is genetic, is there any part of your body that didn't come from your genes, right? Where do you think your brain came from? Is it magic? Like, obviously your genes determine what your brain's gonna look like, what your body's gonna look like. Did it stop at the neck somehow? Probably not. So each gene here of these hundreds that we find that are associated with intelligence determines a little bit, explains a little bit of the variance, right? So, if you take these GWAS scores and you try to predict intelligence for individuals, it doesn't do very well, right? You get like 4 to 10% of the variance. So this isn't something right now that's really great for predicting like individual intelligence. And as I said, you need really big samples for this, right? Over 3,000, didn't even detect anything. You start getting 200,000 and it's like, great. Probably in the future, we'll find more maybe that's associated with intelligence. But right now, we're seeing kind of that these individual genes explain a lower percentage of the variance than we would expect from all of the previous research. And this isn't because it's a better method or something. And I know there's an effect in the research, guys. If people hear things like genes or brains, they tend to believe that the research is like super sciencey, right? This is like an actual effect. It's been measured and studied. Like if you say like brain this, genes this, people are just like, oh yeah, I believe that more. I'm sure it's better. Not actually the case. For measuring things like personality and all of that, psychometrics, still the best. That's where it's at, you know? I remember in one of my last classes, we were asked, it was a cognitive neuroscience class, I think, like, what do you think about the cognitive neuroscience of personality? Is neuroscience great for studying personality? And I think many of, my students there didn't know, like, they didn't have a background in personality. They didn't really know. And I was just like, no, it's really bad for measuring personality. We know almost nothing about the neuroscience of personality. You look at personality traits in the brain, you don't see almost anything. Just the way we look at brains and genes at the moment are just not that good for that. But I think they will be in the future. So now we're going to get into brains a little bit more. I hope I didn't black pill you on brains because, we can still look at some brains. So GWAS and the brain, what do we know? We know from this also that the areas associated with intelligence are also associated with tissue expression, across brain regions. So what does that mean? You can run a correlation at these areas and you can see, all these areas are correlated with intelligence. And you can run a correlation on these areas and you can say, all of these areas also seem to be related to differences in the brain. The way tissue is different individually across individuals in the brain, probably as you would expect. Where do you think intelligence comes from? As I said, it is not the knee, it's the brain. So, next slide, gene expression across the brain. As we said, intelligence does not have just a single spot in the genome. It doesn't also have just a single spot in the brain. There's not just one specific intelligence area. And that's the way people used to think about brains, was like memory is in the hippocampus, or like this is the area for this. And there are some things in the brain that are like very localized, right? You have like the fusiform face area. When you see faces, there's a little area in the brain. It's like, boom, it just lights right up. But neuroscience is moving away from that, especially for more complex things. Some things, they have really dedicated areas. And if you get lesions in those areas, boom, your ability is gone. It's not going to be recovered. But a lot of things are distributed across the brain. And only very recently are we really able to even look at things like that, like functional connectivity, multivariate pattern analysis and all of that. Before, it was just kind of like looking, even just 30 or 40 years ago, like this person lost half of their brain, now they've lost this ability. And that's what you had, was like lesion studies. And then it was looking at MRI and fMRI, and it's kind of like, like, okay, well, this area lights up when this happens, so it's this region. But, the brain is not a bunch of like local areas responsible for each thing. The brain's a network. It interacts. So anyway, digression. There's not just one specific intelligence area, which people have also asked, like, where's intelligence in the brain? It's everywhere in the brain, but there's some areas more closely associated with it. We know, that these genomic regions, as mentioned, are expressed at the neuronal level across cortical regions. So postsynaptic density, right? That affects how well your little neurons connect to each other, how well they transmit signals, neurotransmitter signaling there. And not mentioned in this paper, but I mentioned it. Functional connectivity, how well your brain is organized. Are the connections more dense? Do you have more efficiency between nodes or connections in the brain? That sort of a thing. Let's go on. Next slide. So, pleiotropy and intelligence. Variation in one region of the genome is associated with multiple traits. This is kind of another way we see genetic associations here. So, variation in one region of the brain can be associated with, or the genome, can be associated with intelligence. It can also be associated with other things in general. And we see that variations in some areas of the genome are associated. And that's kind of what might also produce correlations between intelligence and other things that we see. Here is a chart showing the genetic correlation between intelligence and some other things. So, ADHD, lower intelligence, obesity, lower intelligence, a few health things, Alzheimer's disease, major depressive disorder, lower intelligence. And then you go up like intracranial volume. That's going to be a big one when we get into brains, but longevity, that kind of a thing there. So, not going to spend a lot of time on that. Let's go on to the next slide. Intelligence and brain volume. So this is one of the big ones, one of the early things people began to study as far as the neuroscience of intelligence, because, it wasn't that long ago, that's all you could do was like take a brain out and measure how big it was, right? And weigh it on a scale or something like that. So this is still a very, very widely replicated association, that more brain volume, bigger brains, are more intelligent in general. In general, there's some exceptions here. The exceptions have to do with sex differences. So the correlation between intelligence and brain volume is about 0.3 to 0.4. So moderate size correlation there. Still, nonetheless, the sex differences we see in intelligence are pretty small, despite men having much bigger brains. Why is that? Probably there's some compensatory thing going on here, where smaller brains as expressed across the two sexes at least, are a little bit more better organized. And we kind of see those differences in functional connectivity between men and women as well. So we know that actually that's kind of the case, that they're organized a little bit differently, and that does seem to compensate for size differences. But yeah, I mean, it's still a robust association, and that association exists within the sexes. So women with more brain volume have higher intelligence on average compared to other women. Men with more brain volume have higher intelligence on average compared to other men. So we still see this, Anyway, next slide. This is the parietal frontal integration theory, and pretty much everything in this paper following this is kind of looking at this theory. So this was something that tried to summarize basically all of the neuroscience of intelligence that we knew, all of this kind of intelligence-related brain regions that were implicated in like structural imaging, functional imaging, diffusion imaging, looking at white matter and all of that. And so it identified structure and function of the lateral and medial frontal parietal, lateral temporal and lateral occipital cortex, and the underlying white matter connectivity of those areas. So basically looking at a structural kind of network, right? Anyway, that's something to consider. I'm not going to go into detail of all of these brain regions because you're just listing the names of brain regions. I don't think most people understand that anyway. It's not like I remember them all myself. But let's go on. Brain gray matter in this parietal frontal integration theory. Okay, so we know that cortical volume and thickness of gray matter is associated with intelligence. Lesion studies as well support this. And this is supported in the areas, some of those areas that were mentioned in this PFIT theory, okay? So yeah, you see lesions in certain areas of the brain. If those areas in the brain, are the areas implicated in this theory, boom, intelligence goes way down. So another, digression here, if people think that intelligence isn't real or they don't want an IQ test, these tests are used, in practical neuropsychological assessments for people that have brain damage and all of that. So yeah, when you get, in a car accident and half of your brain is deleted and, you're stupid, I hope don't go to the doctor and say, oh, well, I don't believe in intelligence. I don't want an intelligence test. Yeah, because it matters. But we see, in the volumes of the insula, the posterior cingulate, the precuneus, also, greater than 20% correlation here. The thalamus as well. Lots of regions in the PFIT. Like I said, I'm not going to go through all of these different regions where we see correlations between cortical gray matter volume and thickness. It's all in the paper if you want to look at the specific regions. I will show some images from this paper, though, at the end, so you get kind of an idea of the network here and what's going on. White matter tracks and intelligence. So you have your gray matter, your white matter in the brain, right? That produces kind of connections between brain regions, right? What do we see here? Better myelination, right? The kind of fatty substance that covers the axons of neurons. Better transmission. So we see, people that have healthier neurons in that sense, higher intelligence, right? More efficient neurons that transmit things faster. This fractional anisotropy, right? This measures the diffusion of water and the direction of the diffusion of water. That's how you image white matter tracks. And we see that individuals with higher intelligence, they have better directional diffusion, but they also have a lower magnitude of diffusion. So what does that mean? Probably that things are just not going anywhere. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but we do see these robust correlations here. Higher FA, lower MD. So we see these long-range white matter connections implicated in intelligence are also associated with the gray matter areas associated with intelligence. So again, the PFIT, right? We see, that there are certain areas of the brain, gray matter, associated with intelligence, and that the white matter tracks that connect those areas of the brain also associated with intelligence. So we see a structural network associated with intelligence. Let's go on. White matter, there's multiple measures for this, right? There are larger associations when you look at multiple measures of white matter instead of just one thing. If you look at just FA or MD or whatever, probably because these are not overlapping effects. There's different things going on. They're not just the same thing being measured in different ways. And, kind of like how there's many genes that contribute to intelligence and each contributes a little bit of variance. There's many different things going on in the brain related to intelligence. So you have to look at this measurement. You have to look at that kind of measurement and so on. Related to processing speed, as I mentioned, these white matter tracks, right? And, these are small effect sizes, but they're highly replicable, about, 0.3. So this does highlight, as I said, that intelligence is a distributed thing. It's not just localized to any one region, nor is it just a function of any one process going on. If you have gray matter that contributes a little bit to intelligence, gray matter volume, and you have these white matter efficiency that contributes a little bit to intelligence, and there's other things going on, like I said, like functional connectivity, like the organization of the brain and the efficiency of it. You have all of these little things that contribute to intelligence. And that's why if you look at one specific thing, you might say, okay, there's kind of a small correlation here. But then there's a small correlation here too, and there's another small correlation. All of those things add up, right? Because the brain is just a big network, it's a unit, right? It's all working together. It's not just like one thing is going on that determines intelligence. Let's go on to the next slide. So, intelligence and the structural connectome. What is that? Kind of what we were explaining, right? The way the brain is structured and connected and as a network, right? So you have these multivariate measurements of brain connectivity that look at a bunch of different things, kind of as I said in the last slide. We're not just looking at one measure of connectivity. These are much better at predicting intelligence. This is when we start to kind of get a really good picture of like what's going on here. It can capture up to 40% of the variance of intelligence during active tasks. So you're doing some kind of task, some kind of attention task. And we'll get into why it's attention tasks in a little bit, but even 20% resting state. So you're in an MRI, an fMRI or whatever, you're not doing any task. That's not as good at capturing intelligence. It's better if you're doing some kind of task. As I mentioned, nodal efficiency, what is that? Think of a network and think of, you have a node. Think of how well it's connected to other nodes. Think about how far those other nodes are. Think about how the network is organized in hubs, right? Do you have hubs that are really dense and they have good connections to other hubs? Or is it not so dense and it's a little spread out and it's not directly connected to other areas? That's actually functional connectivity in the brain. I think I had another video on this, but I might have just done it for a class or something. I don't know if I uploaded it. But that's what you have there, kind of this connectivity. How efficient is your brain? How efficient is your connectome? So, yeah, intuitive makes sense, doesn't it? But, now we're kind of able to detect and measure it. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm just going to show you some images now. We're getting to the end of the video. This is the parietal frontal integration theory. This shows you some brain regions. I think if you look in the paper at these numbers, in fact, I think this is an image reproduced from another paper. But yeah, if you look at the numbers, it'll kind of show you. But these brain regions are connected, by networks. You see the regions, and then you see kind of the networks that connect them. You might recognize, just looking at this picture, if you're a little bit more familiar with neuroscience, that you're basically looking at here something that overlaps highly with the dorsal attention network, which is also called the task-positive network. Why is that? Because all of this network lights up when you're doing some kind of task, specifically in attention tasks, right? So when you need to focus, when you need to pay attention to something like that, when you need to direct your attention someplace else, boom, this task-positive network or this dorsal attention network lights up. When you're just resting, it's like you get a whole other area of the brain that is kind of active there, right? The default mode network. So we see, that these areas associated in the brain with attention also very closely associated with intelligence, which should tell you something about the relationship between attention and intelligence. Let's go on now to the next slide. This is again a reproduction from another paper they mentioned here, which was a meta-analysis, right, of different brain regions. So this can kind of show you again what is positively correlated with intelligence and what is negatively correlated with intelligence. Some of these areas you see that are negatively correlated with intelligence, that means that there's probably perhaps, you would think like, oh, why would you want something negative? There's no activation in the brain. Yeah, you don't want everything just running all the time, so to speak, to put it, kind of in a metaphor there. But sometimes, good attention or something like that involves suppression of other brain regions. So that might be why you see some areas that are, negatively correlated with intelligence, without getting too in detail. But, if this interests you, you can kind of pause it for a moment and look and see which areas, are associated. But again, we have, large meta-analyses at this point that show which areas of the brain are associated with intelligence. Just important to remember, it's not some mystery like, what is intelligence anyway? What's going on in the brain? We don't even have a clue. We kind of have a clue, we kind of have an idea of like what's going on, what brain areas and structures are associated with intelligence more than others. and many other things, as we mentioned in this video. This shows correlations between cortical thickness and intelligence in children and adults. I think the children are the one in the image C, and adults are D. So again, and again, if you look at D, again, you can kind of see, what does that look like a little bit again? Task positive network, right? Dorsal attention network, some overlap there. But let's go ahead and go on. Cortical volume in image E, and then you have in the top, I guess top right or top left, it's the blue one. That's the fractional anisotropy. So that's measuring the direction of water, and then MD is diffusion. So what do we see here? It's in blue, right? Well, maybe I have that backward. Maybe the orange is actually the FA, because the orange should be positively correlated. If it's FA with intelligence, the blue should be negatively correlated. But again, these are white matter tracks. That's kind of how you measure white matter tracks. It's the diffusion of water and the direction of water is how that's measured in imaging. And that's what we see. Better directional fusion correlated with intelligence, and less diffusion or dispersion. So more focused or something. I don't know how to explain that exactly, but that's what we have going on. Lesion studies. What happens when part of your brain gets deleted, right? You take some drugs and you have a stroke, or whatever. You read too many stupid comments and you have a stroke. Well, we know when certain areas of the brain are damaged, it has a really, really big impact on intelligence. When other areas of the brain are damaged, no impact on intelligence. Why? Yeah, well, some areas of the brain are more important for that. Lesion studies give you kind of a good idea of what they are. I think this is not just a single lesion study, but probably some composite of lesion studies. Again, it's reproduced from another paper, and I didn't actually read this one. But it kind of gives you an idea, that we know, again, from lesion studies, what happens when part of your brain is damaged. Yeah, if it's the right area, your intelligence, it goes way down. So we're running to the end of this now. The last slide. What have we learned? Looking at genes and brains, it still doesn't explain all of the intelligence variation that we see from twin studies, right? Twin studies are kind of the best way, I think, to measure at this point still the heritability of intelligence. Very, very high heritability. And, differences in brains, you have, these small correlations and things like that. They don't explain the full extent to which we see differences in intelligence, right? You take two people or a group of people. Some of them are really intelligent. Some of them are not really intelligent. And you say, wow, there's a really big difference in intelligence between these two individuals, regardless of how you measure it, regardless of what cognitive abilities or tests or anything you use. Big differences, right? You look at the brains or the genes or something, you say, they're not that different. So that's, probably measurement. We aren't that good at looking at brains yet, and we're not that good at looking at genes yet. So, that does mean that psychometrics at this point is still the best way to look at individual differences in intelligence, personality, and all that. Neuroscience, a very, very new field. Why do I never talk about neuroscience very much? Because there's very little in neuroscience that can tell you about like personality and that sort of thing, despite that actually being the field that I'm in. I'm not like a dating psychologist. That's like a hobby, more or less, an interest of mine, research interest, I should say a hobby or whatever. But, there's just not a lot of neuroscience for that. It's a very new field, looking at very, very different things. Psychometrics is still how you measure intelligence and individual differences in intelligence, not by looking at brains or genes. So sometimes people will say, well, what about the brain difference or what about the gene difference? Like, yeah, we see differences. We kind of know what's going on. But where we really see, the differences is when we begin to actually measure the thing that we're looking at. So still, nonetheless, we have identified a lot in the brain. This was a good review of it. This paper here, as I've said a million times. Intelligence, it's in your brain. Where else is it going to be? It's not in your knee. Intelligence, it's also highly genetic. Where else would it come from? It's not entirely genetic, right? But we do see very, very high heritability, and we see across all of these different ways that we kind of know how to measure the genetics of intelligence, different estimates, but never ever is it a blank slate. Maybe I'll conclude on that note, that never ever is it a blank slate. No one believes in the blank slate anymore, except for just people out there in their own folk psychology. There's no blank slate anymore in psychology. There's no blank slate in neuroscience. There's no blank slate in personality psychology. An axiom of personality psychology is person and environment interaction, person being genes. Everything is a product of your genes, your environment, and how the two of those interact. Neuroscience, exactly the same way. No one believes in a blank slate anymore, except for just like random people out there who have somehow been influenced by it. There can be debate as to how much environment impacts something, how much genes impact something. Again, remember the 50-0-50 rule in behavioral genetics. About 50% of whatever you're looking at, kind of average across the board, genes, 50% of whatever you're looking at, non-shared environment, and yeah, zero shared environment. So that's kind of what you're looking at. Anyone telling you about the blank slate or, nothing is genetic, it's all environment, we're all, born exactly the same, we're a carbon copy of the brain. I mean, you can look at people's bodies and you can see that that's not the case. Why would you think that their brains are different? Brains are highly plastic, brains change pretty easily. I mean, so does your body, I guess, if you lift, but yeah, I mean, bizarre to think that, but highly driven by politics. Anyway, final word there. There's no blank slate. Anyway, hope you liked the video. Like the channel, subscribe, hit the bell. We got a Patreon. It's got a lot of smart people in there. They're talking all the time about psychology and sharing papers and stuff like that, contributing ideas for the research. Anyway, if you like the video, you like Diet Psychology, support the project, think about signing up to the Patreon, joining the Discord or whatever. I think there's even a way to subscribe on YouTube now. So again, I'll make another video for you very soon. Hope you liked it. See you guys.